Hi guys, this is Tom, this is Quick Watercolour Birds, and in this episode we're back to using just two colours and we're going to really push this in terms of quickness. Let's take a look. So in the last couple of videos I've been taking requests for birds you might like to see me paint. If you've got one that you would like to see me paint, please drop it into the comments below. I've already got a nice little list lined up, and in this particular episode we are going to look at the greater spotted woodpecker. So I grew up with a family of these living in my garden, and they are really quite striking birds and they are perfect painting fodder. They've got that amazing contrast of the black shapes and the white shapes. We've also then got, of course, the white in shadow, but also that kind of subtlety of colour as black moves into sunlight. And then the cherry on top is that blast of red on the back of the neck and also a little bit on the underside of the belly there. So because of that, it is a great opportunity to look at just using two colours, really simplifying things down and really having a lot of fun and playing with the brush and creating some interesting abstract shapes. The two colours that we're going to use are Pyrrole Red, which is a really orangey warm red, and we're also going to use Phthalo Blue, which is the complete opposing side of the colour wheel. And because they're so opposite on the colour wheel, they cancel each other out and they can give us really rich, lovely deep darks. But then as we add a little bit more water, we kind of move into those lovely kind of soft grey colours. We can tint it a little bit more to be a warm reddy grey, or we can use the blue to make it a cooler, more bluey grey. Then we also have the Pyrrole Red to get that really punchy colour of the bird, and also the strength of the Phthalo Blue if you want to inject some colour into the background. As I said, I am going to really aim for a quick watercolour bird here. I'm going to push it through as quick as I can, keep it fresh, keep it loose, keep it fun, let the paint do its thing. I'm going to use a size 10 and a size 16 round brush, and I'm working on A3 cold press paper, which gives us just that little bit of texture. Please do consider subscribing if you enjoy these videos, and don't forget to hit the bell to be notified of all the upcoming videos that I do have planned. You can hop over to my Patreon teaching channel if you want to see some deeper tutorials, some more full-length paintings, live streams, and loads more other stuff that's exclusive to Patreon. All the links are in the description. But that's it, we're going to take a quick look at the drawing and then we are going to dive into the painting.
Okay, so the drawings always follow a basic process. That is, we start with the biggest shapes first. In this case we've got a kind of oval or egg shape for the body of the bird and a kind of oval or egg shape for the head of the bird. The big thing, as always, is get those the right proportion to each other, and the tilt of those shapes is correct so that we get the gesture and the character of the bird. Once we've got that, I tend to stick on the other shapes, the next size down, so that would be like a triangle for the beak. Again, proportion is correct, the depth of the beak relative to its length, and also the length of the beak relative to the head. And then we pop on the tail as almost a rectangle, and a couple of triangles stuck on for the leg and kind of that back part of the wing. Then we kind of push and pull those raw shapes around, adding bits here, chopping little bits off there, making the overall thing feel a bit more lifelike. So that's that first stage. Once we've got all of that feeling like the silhouette of the bird and it's accurate, then we can start to break it down into smaller shapes within it. So we would start to look for the face, break up some of the markings, look for the bigger area of the shoulder, either break it up into areas of the bird itself like the wing or the underside, or you can break it up by tone, or you can break it up by colour, whatever kind of works for you. But as always, big to small shapes, simple and general to the specific, and then we stick on the little things like the eye right at the end.
Okay, so here we go. So I'm going to kick off with a little bit of Pyrrole Red here. And I've also on my phone recorded my brush strokes up close, because I feel in this one the brush strokes and the way I'm using the brush is especially relevant, although it's always relevant in watercolour. And hopefully showing you this up close will give you a really good insight into the different ways you can use the brush and how to use the brush, along with the paint consistency, which we know is so important. So kick off with that Pyrrole Red. Then very simply adding the Phthalo Blue into it, and you can see straight away, but by simply adding those together, especially at a kind of more intense consistency, so not too much water, this is kind of maybe single cream consistency, we get a really intense dark. It's almost a little bit too stiff there, so I add a little bit of water and a little bit of red just to balance it out, and we get a kind of more neutral dark that's flowing a bit better. Obviously, the more water we add to our pigment, the lighter it gets. And so I just started with that red just to kind of kick things off, and I wanted a bit of a wet into wet mark. And then here I was getting a little bit tight in the face,
kind of needed to start with, but here I just wanted to break with the brush a little bit more, do something a bit bolder just to get things moving. And look at that lovely kind of effect basically that we get with watercolour. It's such a beautiful medium. Sometimes, as I often say, you just lay it down with a simple brush stroke and a nice paint consistency, and then just let it do its thing. We can always drop more paint into it as we go. And just very quickly, as opposed to usual where I quite often piece together a few different photos, not every time but more often than not, in this one I'm just using a straight up photo. It's a copyright free photo from a website called pexels.com. I will put the link to it in the description, and you can also find it, as I said, along with the line drawing over on my Patreon page in the public section there. So what you'll notice I'm doing here is we've got those kind of mid-tone colours, but there's a more kind of bluey mid-tone on the back because there's a dominance of the blue, but the red is still balancing out, so it's not too blue. And then as I've moved into this bottom area, simply to create a little bit more variation and a little bit more interest, I've just given it a bit more of a warm red bias. And you can see that those colours are in the photo. Like the black is a little bit more bluey on the top, and with a little bit of imagination in other places, the black feathers, they kind of push towards being a little bit warmer. And then as the artist, we can decide that we're going to take those kind of things that we see and we can push them a little bit further than they are, just to make the painting a little bit more interesting. So we've got a kind of moist consistency of the paint now. If you haven't seen my recent video on paint consistency, I definitely recommend you go back and look at that, because I go really in detail into the different kind of definitions of paint consistency and how that paint consistency of your mix really influences the effects that you get with the paint when you combine it with understanding at what level of dryness the wash already on the page is. So as an example, that lower wing area, it was kind of fairly wet, probably kind of damp consistency, and I dropped in like a sort of double cream consistency of the mixture of the Pyrrole Red and the Phthalo, which is almost black, and I just kind of splodged it in there while it was still wet, so we get some lovely kind of flowing damp into damp type marks. So on the tail, I just wanted a very simple, almost dry brush technique. So again, that was probably double cream paint consistency, one simple brush stroke, letting it break as it came up into kind of the underside of the bird there. And what I've effectively created now is some lovely kind of simple washes that are all flowing together. If you really think about it and look at it, right from the very first red mark I made, which I then linked directly into the dark around the face, which is linked into the beak, it's linked into all of the feathers on the back and the wings. That is effectively all one big wash, but it's not being tackled as one big wash all at once. I've kind of added bits to it. I've gone, but at the moment, that whole area that transitions right from the tail right up to the beak is all connected as one. And for me, this is a really important part of watercolour. If we can learn to connect all of our different areas and connect our different colours and our different tones, for me, that's kind of one of the really lovely elements of watercolour, that we can then just let the paint kind of flow together. So this was a tricky one because it's white in shadow. It can't be too dark, it can't be too light. I didn't really want it to be too blue, and I certainly didn't want it to be too red, so it took a little bit of balancing of the colour. So just enough red to cancel out the blue, but not so much red that it turned it pinky, and then just enough water to make it a nice halftone. I'm now using a very saturated mix of probably kind of like single cream, maybe full fat milk consistency of the Pyrrole Red, kind of really using the brush to push it on there, really thinking about how I'm using the brush, using the tip of the brush, using the edge of the brush, pushing down, lifting up, letting it release pigment, letting it hold pigment, all of this stuff that just comes with a little bit of experimentation and a bit of practice. And then as you can see in the bottom left corner of the bird, using that red and then purposely hitting the darker colours that I already have there has kind of let them melt together just a little bit, and it gives us those lovely soft marks. And it's these kind of soft and hard edges that I'm going to talk about in the quick tips section. And the quick tips section is going to be right at the end of this rather than in the middle, because this one really motors along pretty fast. And the quick tips that I talk about are to do with edges, and that's going to make more sense once I've actually finished the painting. So here I chuck in almost pure phthalo blue, probably kind of coffee consistency, so it's got a little bit of pigment in there, but also lots of water to get it flow. I'm using that phthalo blue to trap the light on the front breast of the bird, but not being afraid and trying to be a little bit more brave than normal in letting that phthalo blue kind of hit the washes that are within the bird, so we get some softer edges not only within the bird but also between the background and the bird itself. And you'll see me try and push this just a little bit further in a moment. One of the great things about only using two colours is we only have very, very few choices, so we can really focus on our brush strokes, on our paint consistency, and on getting simple but accurate shapes. We're not having to, on top of all of that, learn to kind of manage lots of different colours at once. That can all kind of come as we progress with watercolour, and even a few years into using watercolour, I still enjoy just going back to the simplicity of just using kind of 2 or 3 colours. So just to get that kind of white in shadow on the kind of top part of the wing here, I just very simply go back to the phthalo blue. The tiniest touch of red just takes the edge off it, so it's not quite as punchy as it is in the background. And then as the wing is kind of drying, I just very gently with a light touch brush that blue into that upper white area of the wing, and it just gives a little bit more shape and form, and it kind of eases the transition from the lovely deep rich dark into the kind of light colours or the white in shadow. And then I'm taking exactly the same approach on the face of the bird as well. So we've got the lovely darks in there. Those darks are almost dry, but they've still got a kind of moistness to them. I then use a ever so slightly wetter mixture, being careful not to flood the existing paint that's already on the page. And I just kind of brush it into the face and then allow it to just gently hit the edge of the existing dark. And again, we get those slightly softer edges that I'm going to talk about right at the end. Continue with the phthalo blue coming out behind the back of the bird. So I don't want to go too dark with it because it will kind of interfere with the dark on the back, but I also want to go dark enough that it's kind of gives it a bit more punch. And I'm doing this classic thing, and you can see on the right hand side there how the paint is really flowing together. What we've got is an existing wash that is still very damp on the page, and I'm dropping kind of milky consistency paint into it. And what that's doing is effectively, we're calling it loading the wash. We have an existing wash and I'm loading it with more and more pigment, more and more kind of intensity to really ramp up the colour and also kind of boost the tone just a little bit. And you can see very quickly we've got something, it's really kind of come together fairly quick there. The blue from the background kind of shot into the shadow on the front, the underbelly there, a little bit too much for my taste. So I just go in with a damp brush and just very lightly pull it out, but leave just that little edge there to let it kind of flow together a little bit. The important thing is that the white on the chest stays nice and crisp and sharp against the background, because that's what gives it the definition. And with that definition, I can afford to let other areas flow together just a little bit more. And we're homing in on the finish actually pretty quick here. There's a few bits that need tackling, so I need to look at softening the edge of the leg there. I'm just refining the shape ever so slightly with kind of double cream consistency of paint, almost dry brush. You probably saw it just as a close-up then, how the dry brush gives you these lovely, slightly different marks from the flowing paint. We just need to look at this area just here that I'm working into at the moment. I'm trying not to let the paint bead too much because I'm working on a slight slant. If it beads too much as it dries, that paint will then kind of backwash and we'll kind of get cauliflowers, which are not always a bad thing, but I want to at least be a little bit in control of where they are. We've then got the kind of back wing to do, and then very finally we're going to zoom in on the eye and just bring that to life in a very, very simple way. Definitely worth hopping back and looking at some of my other videos, because the quick tip section of those, one of them is talking about creating very, very simple eyes. Other ones are talking about loading washes. So worth popping back and looking at those. We're now at the kind of dry brush stage of a watercolour. This can be the stage that really starts to make it look finished. Just like in oils and acrylics, when we start to put on our highlights and our thicker paint, in watercolour, for me, although I love the flowing washes, and for me that's one of the most beautiful things about watercolour, it's this dry paint towards the end where the consistency is a little bit stronger, the pigment is a little bit richer, closer to being neat paint. This is what can really bring it to life. These are the little accents and the little marks that make it pop and come to life. So most of my paint consistency here, or those last few marks at least, were what I'm calling the Marmite consistency. Some people call it the butter consistency, Vegemite, whatever kind of makes sense to you, but it's almost neat paint or neat paint. So very, very saturated, very little water. It's going to make, in this case, the mixture of Pyrrole Red and the Phthalo, it's going to make it a really, really rich, dark, great for popping in little accents. What's really lovely, if you put a nice dry brush mark in with a nice rich consistency of paint and you make that brushstroke hit an existing wash on the page, you get some really lovely effects. So as an example, the dark that I did on the back of the bird, I let that hit the background wash, and then I also ran it into a still drying wash on the back of the tail there. You can kind of see just about what I'm talking about. And again, that allows the brush strokes to still have a nice strength to them, but also we get some slightly more wet into wet marks. And then that's kind of it really. I'm very happy to leave the rest of the bird as it is and just focus on creating the eye. So I go in with that kind of grey, or very warm grey, with a real bias towards the Pyrrole Red in there, and I just drop in the overall shape first. We don't have to make this too complicated, bringing the tip to a nice fine point. And a really important point here is paint consistency. If the paint consistency is too dry, it won't flow enough and you'll get a slightly awkward mark. However, if it's too wet, it'll all kind of balloon and pool out of the brush and be very hard to control. So this is probably the most easy consistency to control, which is that kind of full fat milk consistency. There's enough pigment in there that the paint isn't flowing all over the place, but there's also enough water in there that there is some flow, and it makes it easier to move the paint around. And this was so simple, just the dark of the eye, leave a couple of highlights. You could always glaze over one of the highlights to make it slightly softer, make it slightly paler, or slightly darker, sorry. And then what I'm doing is taking a clean damp brush and just pulling some of that pigment around the face to help make those darker marks kind of sit more nicely within the face. And that's it for the eye in this particular one. We can go with more detail, we can do more with it than that, but for this I didn't really feel like I wanted to. And really now it's a case of just again looking for that kind of buttery Marmite consistency and just flicking on these final, what I would call dark accents. You can see the mark I just made above the red. There is actually a lovely rich dark on the photo in the top right hand corner, so I kind of got my cues from that. And just little hits of dark accents just to sharpen places up. This little bit here just helps really refine that kind of under neck of the bird. And that's basically it. Very quick, very simple, really fun.
And as promised, I wanted to look at the quick tips at the end of the video because I thought it would make more sense at this point. So let's have a look. Okay guys, so I wanted to save this until the end of the painting so that I could talk about it in more depth. And what I want to talk about here are different types of edges, and in particular we're going to keep it simple and just focus on hard edges and soft edges. So hard edges are fairly obvious. This is when we have a hard line between one tone, one colour, one area and another one. So we have a hard edge between this dark here and the white here. We have a hard edge, at least here, between the chest and the background. We have all sorts of hard edges everywhere. All of your hard edges are going to kind of give definition, they're going to give sharpness, they're going to give focus. But if we have hard edges everywhere, our paintings can feel a little bit flat, they can lack interest potentially. Also note that sometimes a hard edge is a light against a dark background, but we also have a fairly hard edge here and here, which is a dark against a lighter background, but both are hard edges. So to counteract all these hard edges, we also want to have soft edges. So soft edges are when it's a less perceptible transition between one area, one tone or one colour and another. So for example, this area here, we've got a lovely soft edge between this kind of back area and wing into the tail. We can still kind of tell that the tail is separate from the wing, but it's a softer, more gentle transition. Equally here, the red into this little line here is a soft edge, and then we've got all sorts of lovely soft edges where everything kind of fuzzes together here, and then we've got loads of soft edges in this bit here, and a few little softer edges here and there. So quite often having soft edges in the shadows is a really nice thing to do. Having soft edges between kind of two dominant shapes can just make it feel a bit more natural and a bit softer, obviously. And that's all within the bird. What can be really interesting is looking to soften edges between our background and the object itself. And this is where things can get a little bit scarier, they can get a little bit harder. It's something certainly that I am slowly getting used to doing and not being as brave as I could always be. But it's little things like just letting the background here just flow in to the kind of the underbelly here. Letting the dark of the back here just kind of bleed and melt into the background. So we're kind of getting soft edges not only within the bird, which is the slightly easier approach and a really great one to do, but we're also getting soft edges between the bird and the background. And that's when we really start to get this lovely interaction of different areas and different tones and different shapes. So that's it, just kind of keep a focus on where do I want a hard edge, where can I get a soft edge. If you can bring yourself to do it, let some soft edges and colours kind of melt and flow together. The one tip, as we know, that if this area is very wet and this area is very wet, then these colours are going to flow together much more. But this area was only really maybe a little bit damp, and this area was also slightly less water and more pigment, so they did flow together but not too much. So a lot of this is understanding and learning to control your pigment. If you want to know more about that very specifically, I suggest you hop over and look at the watercolour clock episode I just recorded and released as part of Watercolour Bites, and we really go into a lot of depth about what's happening on the page and what's happening in your brush and how those different kind of factors interact with each other and create different effects. So I highly recommend you hop over and look at that. There we go, guys. That was so much fun to just focus on those abstract dark shapes and those abstract light shapes, letting the paint do its thing and flow to get those subtle variations of colour and tone, especially within the darks. And I really just tried to enjoy making marks with the brush, and I highly recommend that for this one in particular. But with all watercolour painting, just enjoy what the brush does, enjoy making marks, enjoy laying down the paint. And then in this one, I really tried to release from keeping all of my different areas separate, and I really did push myself to at least let some of the washes flow together between the background and the foreground of the bird. Not always easy, but I gave it a go and it did work in places, and that's something that I'm personally trying to push a little bit further with my own painting. It was definitely a quick one of the quicker ones of the whole series, and sometimes it can be really fun to set yourself a time limit. It forces you to kind of be decisive and bold with your decisions when you're painting, and decisive and bold with your brush strokes, and those are two things that you will always get rewarded for with watercolour. Please do feel free to share this with anyone else you feel may enjoy it. That also really helps me out. And until next time, guys, happy creating, happy living, and I shall see you soon.